purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny die Gedanken sind frei.
Welcome to Freethought Forum. I'm your host, Hugh Henry, and we're here to find out why Mr. James Barrett here is an atheist. Now, Jim, I know, has been a successful businessman in many different businesses over his lifetime, and he has a huge library. He does an awful lot of reading both about atheism and about people who say there is a God. And frankly, I depend on him as my cliff notes when it comes to people like Ingersoll, and I read weird things like the man who mistook his wife for a hat and stuff like that. So, James, how did you become an atheist?
Well, Hugh, this goes back to my childhood. My mother took me to a very fundamentalist church, and the minister was always talking about hell and how long you'd be there. And I remember that he said if a bird came if the world didn't have any water in it, and a bird came every 1,000 years with a drop of water in its beak and dropped it until the earth had the amount of water we had now, the first second of eternity would not have passed. And that scared me very much. And so I made every attempt to become a believer and get saved. And you had to be a believer in order to be saved. And I kept thinking in the back of my mind, I don't really know if this is true. And also the stories they told out of the Bible seemed very unbelievable to me. Plus, many of them were very cruel. And then when I got to be an adult, I had heard that them talk about Robert Ingersoll, Thomas Paine, and Voltaire, telling that when they died, they all went screaming to their graves because they knew they were not going to heaven. And they were telling how terrible they were. So one day I was in the library, and this, by the way, was after my first wife had managed to get me reading because I hadn't finished the 6th grade in school. So I went to the library, and I thought I would look up one of these persons to see what they were like, and so I got a book by Robert Ingersoll called Some Mistakes of Moses. And I ended up thinking the man was wonderful, and he was a very humorous writer, and I laughed through most of the book, but he posed questions that were unanswerable about the first 5 books of the Bible. This convinced me that my doubt was well-founded. And so I slowly but surely became an atheist. At first I considered myself an agnostic, but later I said, I don't think I'm in the middle or in doubt about my disbelief, and so I became an atheist.
Did you feel guilty about becoming an atheist? And how did you give yourself permission if you did?
I don't really think I was guilty as far as, if you mean, did I think that maybe I was being terrible being an atheist, but I was afraid to talk to others about it because I knew that wasn't a popular thing to be.
Then you've been a closet atheist at times.
Oh, I was a closet atheist for years until just a few years ago.
Okay, why were you a closet atheist specifically?
Well, the people that I associated with I knew would not be very understanding. They were not free thinkers, and most of them even bragged about going to church and about their association with church and their belief and everything. But I didn't notice that it helped make them better people. Many of them, in fact, were very, I would consider, bad people, and yet they were very strong on their belief.
When you did tell people that you were an atheist, how did your friends and your relatives, and how did they react?
They reacted by rejecting me or putting me at a distance. I remember that my stepdaughter, when she first heard I was an atheist, she was very cold, and she just ignored me. I was at a Thanksgiving dinner when she had heard about it.
That's pretty cruel. That happens. Now, it's one thing to admit to your friends and relatives that you're an atheist, but you're here with me, and you're public. When did you become public that way? So that
it was after I learned of this organization, and I heard about it through purchasing books from Prometheus, which puts out a lot of books on free thinking. And they had the name and telephone number of facts, and I called them, and so I started becoming more open with my atheism.
Why did you become more open? Why did you become public?
Because I was really ashamed that that I couldn't understand why should I be hesitant about admitting that I was an atheist. Was there something wrong with being an atheist? And I thought that the people that rejected me, that was their problem, not mine. And I thought, I had to think it over, and I thought, what is there to be ashamed of? I think that being an atheist is a very good thing. It shows that I chose to think instead of believe.
Again, it's one thing to become public, but I know you're active. I mean, you're here, you're on my show quite a few times. Why did you become active for atheism and atheists?
Well, when I started going to the group, it just relieved me that I was able to talk with people, and I decided that Christians, after all, say they want to share their good news, and I think atheism is really good news, so I wanted to become active because I think that atheism can actually help. I believe that a lot of the problems we have come from the belief in the Bible and in the cruelty and the lack of common reason that's used.
Have you or your wife or your children ever been threatened because of your atheism by an overt threat? Somebody?
No, I don't really think that I've been threatened as far as bodily or physical harm. I have had, the only thing is I've had people that stopped associating with me and talked behind my back to other people, and pretty soon I noticed that other people that I had not talked to about atheism were aware that I was an atheist.
How do you feel about first religion in general? Not Christian, just religion in general.
Well, I think of religion as being something that I would consider immature people would choose to believe in, because you might as well believe in the tooth fairy. To me, it's saying that there's some type of a spirit or power out there. I wonder why. How could you define such a power if it's infinite? And so I think it's very unrealistic.
How do you feel about Christians in general?
Well, I don't dislike Christians. I've known some very good people that were Christians, but I say they were good in spite of their belief. But there are Christians that aggravate me because they try to proselytize, or maybe they put on a big show of being very religious, and yet and saying that this is that you couldn't be moral without being a Christian. Yet I consider some of them very immoral.
How do you feel about born-again, proselytizing, right-wing Christians in general?
This is, of course, the strong point. The more fundamentalist that Christians become, the more annoying they get to be, and then they want to force their opinion. They're very opinionated that their particular belief is the only true belief that there is, and that everybody else is going to hell except them. And they even state that narrow is the way, and few there are that will find it. And they reject anything that does not follow their narrow point of view, and so they can be very annoying sometimes.
You have children, right? Or don't you? I don't know.
I had one child by my first wife, but he passed away before he was a year old. My wife that I had for 35 years passed away in December, and she had 4 children before I was married to her. And of course now they have grandchildren.
What's the story about them and atheism, particularly your atheism?
Well, I think I mentioned about one of the 4 children. 2 of them were twin daughters, and one of them just doesn't bring the subject up, and the other one, when I see her, she will kind of make sideways remarks as though she's not talking about me, and yet I know she's referring to me. And in fact, one time she mentioned that atheists are always proselytizing and going around trying to convert others. And I told her, I said, well, that's funny. I've only had Christians coming to my door.
How about your grandchildren?
I really haven't had any discussion with them on it. I don't see them as much as I do the children, and then so I don't know. They're probably aware of it. I imagine at least the 4 children that the one daughter Camille has. I'm sure that she's probably mentioned it to them, but there hasn't been any sign yet from them.
Okay. I know you and I have different atheisms, and we love to argue. And since I've reached the end of my questions here, it's time for us to duke it out here in front of the public.
Well, I think this is one of the wonderful things about being a free thinker, and that is that we allow other people to have their own opinions, and we're not always going to come to the same conclusions. I think that life is too complicated, and I will quote Dr. Feynman, and he says that finding truth, it takes a lot of work, and even then I don't think you're really sure you found it.
I know you're very much a materialist atheist, in that spiritual is right out, and anything supernatural or paranormal is right out.
Yes, in fact, since I was a child, I saw a magic show one time when I was a child, and my thinking at the time, I remember, was not, oh, this is magic. I was wondering what mechanics went on, and today I say that nature is not caprice, that things happen in a natural force, and that they're not changeable. If something happens, it happened because that's the way it happened. If it happens differently, it means that there was some other element that changed it. We may not always be able to perceive what change there was, but illusion is very easy to come by. But then when you see how the magic trick was performed, it can disillusion you a lot about how complex it is.
I know Houdini and the author of Sherlock Holmes were very good friends.
That's right.
And I can't remember the guy's name. Can you help me out with that? Author of Sherlock Holmes?
Arthur Conan Doyle.
Anyway, Doyle was unlike his character, Doyle was an utterly credulous person. He even went with the little girls who used the paper cutouts and the fairies at the bottom of the garden. And he was convinced that Houdini dematerialized himself in his escape acts. So Houdini put Doyle up directly over the stage, looking right down on the thing. And either Houdini was so good or Doyle was so convinced, or both, that after the act, Doyle was still convinced. So Houdini gave up on the project. He couldn't straighten him out at all. He was sorry about it.
Well, I think this is very typical of people that become believers because they don't rely on their senses. As a matter of fact, what was the name of? Well, there was a philosopher. One though, René Descartes, was very much the same. He said you have to throw out your reason. And they do that. I've observed many people. In fact, I had a doctor friend of mine that called me up and he said he witnessed on television a person who could shoot targets blindfolded. And the next week I happened to see a magician perform the same thing and explain that it's nothing but a trick, and still he wasn't convinced.
Yeah. I know you're a big fan of Randy and Shermer in the Skeptical Inquirer.
That's correct.
And I am absolutely not. Because I would agree that there isn't anything that's supernatural and there isn't anything that's paranormal, but that those things do happen, and to call them supernatural or paranormal is to stick them in a ghetto, shove them off the table so you can ignore them, rather than live with the fact that they've happened. I know Randy prides himself that he can duplicate any of these things, and he's asked people, he's got a $1 million bet up, yes, and say, you demonstrate anything supernatural and paranormal to me, and I'll pay off my $1 million. I don't think he ever will, no matter what happens. There have been several cases where he should have paid and he didn't. But that never makes it into the Skeptical Inquirer, of course.
Well, Randy does not claim to be able to prove that these things are not so. All he asks is for them to prove they are so, and he wants it to be done according to acceptable scientific standards. And if he's able to duplicate the same thing, I think that's a case in point. Now, I don't exactly know how your mind works on it, but you stated that you didn't believe in paranormal and things like that, and that people should be open to it. I have investigated. For instance, firewalking used to, where they walk on hot coals. This used to, I didn't though consider it magic. I just wondered how could it happen. Well, I have since found the explanation for it, and yes, in that sense, I constantly ask how something happens or why it happens that way, and I don't just ignore any other answer. I look for the answers all the time, and so far I have never seen any convincing proof that there's such a thing as ESP or spirits or ghosts or people being able to, for instance, psychosurgery.
Yeah.
And it looks very convincing to people, but actually it's just a big hoax. And I've found and crop circles and things like that. Yes, I always examine them. I examined very closely the Bermuda Triangle, and the writers who write about it are good fiction writers. They take a fact and then they put a lot of fiction around the fact.
I would agree with you on the Bermuda Triangle. In fact, we have a local one, legendary thing called the Zone of Silence that exists south of Texas in Mexico somewhere that turns out to be nothing but hype. It's supposed to be very mysterious. And yeah, they've sorted out firewalking as a simple physiologic possibility. But
let them try heating a steel plate up red hot and then try walking on that.
yeah. In the case of some of the other things, though, like ESP, there was a statistician who worked at Rhine Institute who packed it up and left. And the reason he packed it up and left is he said, look, he says, either what they're doing here, either I have to deny what the laws of statistics in order to deny what I've seen as far as what they're doing here, or ESP is valid. He says, I'm not going to work on any more decimal points. It's stupid. He says, it's, as near as I can tell, it's a fact. And I don't want to play around with adding more decimals to this thing. Anything else would have been proven long ago. Which gets us to Randy and Shermer's idea of extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, which is not a scientific principle whatsoever. And extraordinary is a extremely subjective call. It has nothing to do with science or the principles of science.
Well, I disagree. I
was hoping you would.
Something that's that's a very simple point. For instance, if you say you have a purple frog, it'd be very easy for you to show it to me. I may try to find it if you dyed it purple or something like that, but I think that's a rather small thing compared to some things. In the case of ESP, I cannot disprove ESP, but on the other hand, I have never seen any very convincing proof, and I think that this is a case where the fact that somebody said, well, I have experienced ESP, it takes more convincing proof than that to convince me that there is such a thing as ESP. Now, I examine questions like that and search out very carefully, but my mind keeps going back to, well, exactly what is ESP and how could it work? How could a mind communicate with another mind, or how could a mind be able to know that something is so just by using their mind? I don't quite understand that, and I'd have to see some very convincing proof to prove that it's so, not just the type of demonstrations that they make, because I've seen too many demonstrations that seem to be convincing, faith healing and bending spoons, and so it takes a lot more than the type of proof that I've been subjected to prove that there's such a thing as ESP.
Well, at the time of the founding of this country, and shortly after, there were a couple of professors, geology professors from Harvard, who thought they'd actually found meteorites. And Thomas Jefferson, when he heard about this, said wrote that he would rather have believed that two Yankee professors had lied than that stones had fallen from the sky, because stones falling from the sky made no sense. He couldn't figure out the mechanism. He couldn't figure out how it could possibly happen. So he could not accept the phenomena.
Well, ignorance never proves a fact. And yes, he was not convinced, but scientists constantly have things like that. They have to become convinced, and I think that he just hadn't been convinced. He was ignorant of the fact that there is such a phenomenon, and but later we're able to understand that there is such a thing. I don't think that disproves the fact that people doubt. I think it only confirms it, because eventually we're able to be convinced that such a thing exists. But to accept it immediately just because you hear of it would not be scientific and would not be logical.
But how do you explain large numbers of witnesses who have completely unconnected, reliable people who are not nuts? Sometimes they don't even know that there's another person who's seen this at all, who have witnessed things, and they're not believers. In fact, they don't even want to believe, and they stumble into this stuff. And there are countless and countless stories and interviews with these people. It just stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks. And at that point, you have data that seems reasonable enough. It would seem that, you've got something, although you may not know what it is.
Well, that's interesting, and I'm constantly faced with that. But you have to remember that many people have supposedly seen flying saucers.
That's exactly what I was referring to.
And being convinced that such a thing exists. Now, I've had people say, do you think there's such a thing as UFOs? And I say, certainly there's such a thing. Well, what does UFO mean? It means unidentified flying object. But it's very easy for a person's mind to be tricked. And even sometimes so-called experts, scientists are not necessarily trained in trickery, and there have been there have even been scientists that were convinced that I forget what the name of the person is that went around bending spoons and
Uri Geller.
Yes, Uri Geller, and he's had some intelligent people that were convinced that he was actually bending spoons using his mind. But my mind says, well, how could this possibly happen? I don't say immediately, no, it couldn't happen, but I want to see some convincing proof that he could do it. And then I find out that this is duplicable, that illusionists can do the same thing as he does. Now, I have heard of people that supposedly help the police solve crimes, and yet and a few policemen have even reported so. But I find out it's they had a good program on television just recently about these people who are able to communicate with the dead, and they're able to tell people things about it. But then it was explained exactly, cold readings and how they do it. But people are convinced, and you have mass audience because they get large number of audiences too, and most of the people come away convinced that this person was actually able to do it. But I have witnessed that he fishes the answers out of the people, and they tell them themselves.
Well, Jim, you're a hard-nosed man, and I'm glad to have you around. This has been Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum and Jim Barrett, and How You Become an Atheist. Thank you very much.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Decadent sin fry, no